Today's video mini lecture is going to look at protests and protest culture in the Republic of Korea. In our class on protest in Japan, we saw that much of the protest and artistic activity associated with protest had to do with defining what is Japan, what is Japanese-ness, what sort of country do we want to live in the modern post-war era. In Korea, when protest activity really starts to take off, then in Korea as well, we see a lot of the arts included in the protest to make the protest more dynamic and to get more people involved. A lot of what we're talking about is the Minjung Munhwa Undong. And so we have this people's cultural movement, which is part of the greater Minjung movement. So the Minjung movement is primarily talking about democratization of Korea. But the part that perhaps is most interesting for our class is the refocusing on Korean arts. And in this time period of the Minjung Munhwa Undong, we have a lot of young people in Korea, college students in Korea, who are getting deeply involved with their own traditional performing arts as part of reclaiming themselves as being the true representatives of Korea. So instead of allowing the government to define what is Korean, the young college students were defining what is Korean, and one of the ways they were doing that is participation in folk performing arts, most commonly drumming, mass dance dramas, and to some extent even using shamanism. So students would gather to study Korean traditions outside of classes. And this was a type of a club activity. And of course, not all students participated. This would be something for more left-wing students to be interested in. And they would learn about these traditions and debate about culture and all of that, and also learn how to perform these traditional arts. And then later, that arts training would resurface in demonstrations. So students would know how to drum en masse in a demonstration to, build up the energy and all of that. Or they would use things like mass dance dramas to attract an audience. So as soon as an audience would be gathered around and they would be watching, then at that point they could switch and start making political speeches, or they could perform a more heavily politicized version of the drama. So they would actually adjust the traditional dramas to create the points that they wanted to make about Korean society at that time. And then later, they transitioned into just making something called madanguk, which is not traditional, but it uses a lot of traditional techniques to make very politicized stories. And there are still madanguk that are performed today. Not all of them are as politicized as they were in the past, and they come in a much greater diversity of stories than we would see in the 1980s, for example.
Demanding the ousting of President Park Geun-hye. We can take you to Seoul to have a look at the live pictures that we're getting from the South Korean capital now. Police were expecting around 170,000 people to turn out, while the protest organisers estimated as many as 1 million could be there. The protest is considered to be one of the biggest in the country since its democratisation 30 years ago. Park Geun-hye's presidency has been shaken by suspicion that she let a long-time confidant manipulate power from behind the scenes. A Gallup Korea poll showed Park's approval rating remained at an all-time low of 5%.
What you could see in the two videos that I just showed you is that there's a shift in the way that protests are happening, and they become less confrontational and less violent. And the particularly large turning point is 2002 World Cup, because in 2002, the World Cup brought people onto the street, whole families together, enjoying, cheering together, having actually a lot of fun. And then right after the World Cup ended, there was a protest movement about 2 middle school girls. It was an anti-American military protest. Anyway, people took the same techniques that they've been using during the World Cup, and they just transitioned it to being a protest against the US military. So we go from violent struggle to something that starts to be called a candlelight festival, where people hold candles commemorating the lost, in this case, the 2 middle school girls. And there's live performances of music and things like that. And you can bring your whole family. But there are still violent protests, and there's people who use suicide, including self-immolation, in protests. There are sit-ins and lie-ins, hunger strikes, Sambo Ilbe, which is where somebody will take 3 steps and then prostrate themselves full length on the ground, and then 3 more steps and then prostrate themselves on the ground again. It's particularly used in religious groups when they protest, Buddhist groups when they protest. Religious ceremonies are also used in protest, as I've mentioned before. And there's political theater, like the Maranguk that we just talked about, and other protests as well. And also sky protests, like this woman dressed in blue here, who spent hundreds and hundreds of days up on a tower at her workplace to achieve her goals. So there's a lot of different types of protests that are happening, and a lot of creativity in protests. When we talk about protests, we can basically divide them into 2 main types. They're either reactive protests against something that already happened, or they're proactive protests to achieve a specific goal. So a really good example of a proactive protest are a lot of environmental protests that are trying to change the way that we use resources for the good of the future. So there are mass movements, and mass movements, the best example obviously is these 2016 movement to get Park Geun-hye to step down, to impeach her. Labor movements, a prominent type of protest that we can see today in Korea. Rights-based movements, such as feminist movements, for example. And of course, there are all kinds of different protests that are being held by one person or by a very small group, such as standing outside of a government office with information, someplace that they will be seen repeatedly. And I will let the rest of the discussion happen in the classroom.